Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at something you might not expect.
Okay.
The link between minimum wage and gender in Morocco's factories.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's fascinating how a policy that seems totally neutral
Right.
can actually have a really different impact on men and women
Yeah,
when you
exactly.
actually look under the hood.
It really highlights how important it is to consider all these different angles when we're talking about economic policy,
Right.
not just take it at face value.
Totally. So our guide for this deep dive is this paper by Louise-Paul-Delvaux.
Okay.
It's called Minimum Wage, Informality, and Gender Gaps. Evidence from Morocco.
Right.
But we're going way beyond just the numbers here. I
Yeah.
want to really understand what this means for women working in these factories.
Absolutely.
So can you paint us a picture of what Morocco's labor market even looks like,
Sure.
especially when it comes to women?
So imagine a labor market where 65% of non-agricultural workers don't have formal contracts or the protections that come with them.
A lot.
That's Morocco's informal sector.
Okay.
And it plays a huge role in the story.
Gotcha.
Now, if we zoom in on women,
Okay.
only about 22% of them are even in the workforce,
Wow.
compared to 71% of men.
That's a huge difference.
Yeah, and on average, women earn a whole 28% less than their male counterparts.
Wow. 28%, that's a big gap.
It's significant.
Yeah, huge.
Yeah.
So you mentioned this informal sector.
Right.
How do minimum wage laws even work in that kind of setting?
So technically, the minimum wage laws are set by the government after negotiations with unions and employers.
Okay.
They only apply to the formal sector.
Right.
But enforcing those laws is a whole other challenge.
Yeah.
We're talking random audits.
Oh, wow.
Not enough inspectors.
Really?
Lots of gray areas.
Huh. Okay. So this minimum wage increase we're talking about, it happened between 2009 and 2015.
Right.
A pretty big jump, like a 24% increase.
Yeah, big jump.
What happened when that new minimum wage went into effect?
So on the surface, it seemed like a success.
Okay.
The minimum wage did what it was supposed to do, boost wages for those at the bottom,
Okay.
especially women who managed to keep their jobs
Okay.
in the formal sector.
Okay, so that's good news, right?
You would think.
Higher wages mean a better standard of living for those families.
You'd think so, but
Oh.
here's where things get a little unexpected.
Okay.
The research found that this minimum wage increase actually led to more women leaving formal manufacturing jobs,
Wait, hold on.
not fewer.
Higher wages, but more job losses? How does that even make sense?
It comes down to the types of companies where a lot of women were working.
Okay.
Think smaller factories, often less productive.
Right.
They suddenly had to pay their employees a lot more,
Yeah,
and they just couldn't absorb that added cost.
I see.
A lot of them had to cut jobs or even shut down altogether.
So the women who were supposed to be helped by this minimum wage increase were actually the ones most likely to lose their jobs.
Exactly.
And to make matters worse, a lot of these women ended up being pushed into that informal sector
Right,
that
exactly.
we talked about earlier, which means even lower wages.
Yes.
No benefit.
No benefit.
Way less security.
It's a much more precarious existence.
Wow. Talk about unintended consequences.
Right.
It's like you try to fix one problem
Yeah.
and you just create a whole bunch more.
Exactly.
So why were women specifically more vulnerable to these job losses?
Okay.
Was it just because they were working at those smaller factories?
That's part of it, but there is another piece to this, and it has to do with something called outside options.
Outside options.
Okay.
I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So think of it this way. How easy would it be for you to find another decent job if you lost your current one?
Yeah.
It depends on where you live,
Mm-hmm.
what skills you have,
Yeah.
what other opportunities are available. Well, for a lot of women in Morocco's manufacturing sector, those outside options are pretty limited.
Okay.
They're less likely to be able to move to a different city for work.
Right.
And switching to a different industry isn't always easy either.
So it's like they're stuck
Yeah.
with very few choices if their job disappears.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that lack of flexibility made them way more susceptible to job losses when the minimum wage went up.
Wow.
It really highlights how policies that seem neutral
Right.
can actually make existing inequalities even worse.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's crazy, right? It's not just about the wages.
Yeah.
It's this whole web of other factors
Exactly.
that are limiting these women's choices.
Right.
And making them so vulnerable.
Mm.
So the research actually dug into what happened to these women
Yeah.
who lost those formal jobs. Where'd
Right.
they go?
So as you might expect,
Yeah.
a lot of them ended up in the informal sector. We
Right.
talked about the downsides of that.
Yeah, lower pay, no benefits, very little security.
Exactly. But here's the thing that really got me.
Okay.
The research also found that women were more likely than men to just drop out of the workforce altogether
Oh, wow.
after losing their formal jobs.
That's so sad. Like they just hit a wall and
Yeah.
gave up.
It's really tough.
But why though?
Well, it goes back to those outside options.
Okay.
If you can't easily relocate for a new job, or you don't have the skills to like transition industries,
Right.
your choices are super limited. And for a lot of women in Morocco, those limitations are like compounded by social and cultural factors.
So it's like they're facing this double whammy
Yeah.
of economic limitations and societal pressures
Exactly.
that are just pushing them out.
Pushing them out of the workforce.
Wow. So we've talked a lot about like the downsides of
Yeah.
this minimum wage increase,
Right.
especially for women.
Right.
But the research also kind of hints at some like potential positive outcomes.
It does.
Right. Something about like increased efficiency.
Yes.
I'm curious about that.
So there is a silver lining here. Remember how we discussed those larger, more productive firms?
Yeah.
And how they kind of absorbed workers from the smaller firms?
Yeah, the ones that couldn't keep up.
That couldn't keep up with the higher labor costs?
Right.
Well, that shift in the workforce could lead to greater efficiency over time.
Okay, wait, explain that to me.
Sure.
How does moving workers from one factory to another make the whole system more efficient?
Okay, so think of it this way. Larger companies often have more resources to invest in technology, training, better equipment.
Yeah.
They can also benefit from economies of scale, so they can produce more goods at a lower cost per unit.
Okay.
So when you move workers from less productive firms to these more productive ones, the overall output can actually increase.
So even though there's all this pain and disruption in the short term.
Yeah, with job losses and uncertainty.
Right.
In the long run, it could be good for the economy as a whole.
Okay, interesting.
But of course, it's not that simple.
Right.
We can't just shift workers around and hope for the best.
We got to think about the people.
We have to consider that human cost of those job losses, provide support during that transition, and make sure that those larger companies aren't abusing their growing power.
Right, exactly.
It's a delicate balance.
Totally. So speaking of impact,
Yeah.
what about the effect on the gender pay gap?
Okay.
Did the minimum wage help or hurt?
It's a complicated question.
Okay.
On one hand, the increase did contribute to a small reduction in the gender pay gap.
Okay.
Even when you consider those negative impacts on women's employment, the wage boost was big enough to partially offset the losses.
So step in the right direction, but maybe not a huge leap forward.
Yeah, and we have to remember that a lot of women ended up in the informal sector, where the pay gap is even wider.
Right, and there are fewer protections.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a mixed bag.
Definitely.
It sounds like minimum wage increases on their own aren't like a magic solution for gender equality.
No, it's a much more complicated issue.
Totally. So if you're like advising the Moroccan government, what would you recommend? Like what else could they do to actually support women workers?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
The research doesn't give specific policy recommendations,
Okay.
but it does highlight some key areas to focus on.
Okay, like what?
First, we have to address those outside options.
Okay, so give women more choices.
More choices, more pathways to economic security.
Gotcha.
That could mean investing in education and training to give women the skills they need in a changing job market. It could also mean making it easier to move between sectors or regions, like better transportation or more affordable housing.
So basically removing those barriers that keep women trapped.
Yeah, trapped in low-paying, insecure jobs. And we need to think about how to support those smaller, less productive firms that are having trouble adapting.
The ones that are struggling.
Maybe there are ways to give them financial assistance, tax breaks, or even training to help them boost productivity.
So instead of letting them go under, you help them compete?
Exactly. And we can't forget about the informal sector. It's a huge part of their economy. And ignoring it won't solve anything.
So how do you improve things there?
Well, we need to find ways to improve working conditions and wages and create pathways for those workers to move into formal employment.
If they want to.
Exactly.
So this all makes so much sense.
Yeah.
But I have to say, it feels a little overwhelming.
I know.
It's such a huge problem.
It's a big one.
Where do we even start?
It's a challenge, for sure.
Yeah.
But I think this research is a good starting point. It shows us how complex these issues are and how well-intentioned policies can have unintended consequences.
Totally.
And how important it is to consider gender dynamics.
In every aspect of economic policy.
Exactly.
Knowledge is power.
Absolutely.
The more we understand this stuff,
yeah,
the better we can push for policies that actually create a more just and equitable society.
And that's the goal.
That's what it's all about.
And remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation.
Okay, so the big takeaway for our listeners is that minimum wage increases. They can boost wages.
They can.
But they're not a magic bullet for gender equality.
No.
We need a much more holistic approach.
We do.
One that addresses those root causes of inequality and provides real support for those who are most vulnerable.
Well said.
Before we wrap up part 2,
the
one more interesting thing from this research that we have to talk about.
Oh, yeah.
It's about how those minimum wage increases actually shifted the whole balance of power in Morocco's manufacturing sector.
It did.
So remember all those smaller firms who were struggling?
Yeah.
And how the bigger firms kind of absorbed those workers.
Right. It's a trend the researchers call employer concentration.
Employer concentration. Okay.
Basically, the minimum wage increases ended up squeezing out the smaller players.
Wow.
And the bigger ones got even more dominant.
So fewer companies, less competition.
Right.
What does that mean for the workers?
Well, it's not great.
Especially for the women.
Especially for the women.
Yeah.
When you have a few huge companies controlling most of the market, they have so much leverage.
Yeah.
They can basically set wages, working conditions, even benefits.
Right.
It really tips the scales in favor of the employers.
Yeah.
And it weakens the workers' bargaining power.
It's like this domino effect.
Yeah.
The minimum wage goes up.
Right.
Smaller firms get squeezed. Bigger firms get bigger and more powerful.
Exactly.
And ultimately the workers, especially the women, end up worse off.
Potentially, yeah.
So what can we even do about that?
Well, there are a few things to consider.
Okay, like what?
One is strengthening workers' collective bargaining power.
Okay. So, give them a stronger voice.
Give them more leverage.
Yeah.
Maybe encourage unionization.
Okay.
Provide legal support for workers who want to organize. Or even set industry-wide standards.
For wages and benefits.
Exactly.
They have some protection.
Yeah.
Another idea is to increase competition.
Yeah. Encourage new firms to enter the market.
Okay.
Or support smaller ones.
Yeah.
Help them grow and compete.
So they don't get swallowed up.
Exactly.
And of course, there's always government oversight.
Right.
Making sure those big companies are playing by the rules.
That they're not exploiting workers.
Right.
Or engaging in unfair labor practices.
This has been so interesting.
It is fascinating.
We started out talking about minimum wage and gender. And we ended up talking about power dynamics.
Yeah. Competition. Structure of the whole industry.
It's all connected.
It's all intertwined.
So for our listener,
the
takeaway here is
even well-intentioned policies
can have huge consequences.
Unforeseen consequences.
And we really need to think about those ripple effects.
And those root causes.
Not just the symptoms.
Well said.
We've given you a lot to think about.
I hope so.
But hopefully this has sparked your curiosity.
Yeah.
And you'll keep learning about these issues.
That's what we're here for.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It was a pleasure.
We'll be back soon with another one.
Until then,
keep learning, keep questioning,
keep pushing for a better world.
We'll see you next time.